Okay, I just started the recording. Here's a question. Did it do the thing where it like talks to you? It's like, it's being recorded. Okay. I tried to turn that off because I think it's annoying and I think it like bothers people, but that's fine.
But it didn't actually talk to us. It
Yeah, I
just
actually
gives a
didn't hear
prompt.
it.
It was
Oh,
just a
nice.
prompt.
Okay, good. Yeah, I hate when it like is like this session's being recorded and then someone's like in the middle of talking and it interrupts them. So, okay, I'm so glad. Hooray. All right, we're like 1 minute out. I might go ahead and start it so that people have time to join. Sound good? Okay, cool. You look great. All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give it a few minutes for everyone to join. But and before we get started, please use the chat to introduce yourself and let us know where you're joining us from today. Awesome. I see people filtering in. So we can go ahead and get started. My name is Holly Darrow. I'm a communications strategist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. Thank you for joining us for today's Clean Energy Solutions Center webinar, which is presented in partnership with the Clean Energy Ministerial Electric Vehicles Initiative and the UN Climate Technology Center and Network. Today's session is titled New Paradigms of Policies for Electric Vehicles, or EVs, and EV infrastructure expansion for developing countries. Before we get started, we have just a few Zoom housekeeping things that we want to go over. So this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you after. You will be automatically muted upon joining and throughout the webinar, but you can use the chat feature as you are now to add comments and share input. And then please use the Q&A function in the bottom of your toolbar, as you can see on the screen, to ask questions for our speakers today. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat feature to message me, Holly Darrow. You can adjust your audio through the audio settings. If you're having issues, you can also dial in and listen by phone, and that information can be found in your registration email. Finally, we'll be launching a survey when the event ends, and we'd appreciate it if you fill it out because we use your feedback to improve our events in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to today's moderator, who is Jal Desai from NREL.
Thank you, Holly. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. I know it's going to be very productive and interesting webinar as we have got interesting speakers lined up. This webinar is brought to you by Clean Energy Solutions Center, Electric Vehicles Initiative, two of the work streams of the Clean Energy Ministerial, and the Climate Technology Center and Network. I welcome all the participants and speakers, and it's great to see the participation from around the world. And as Holly mentioned, please type in your questions in the Q&A section for the speakers. Let me give you a rundown of agenda and speakers for today's webinar. So first, I'll give an overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, and then we have got Sarbojit Paul, who will be giving the introduction about the Electric Vehicle Initiative, and then we'll be hearing from Dai who would be giving overview about the UN CTCN, and then we'll be hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Conley about the Global EV Outlook 2023, and then we would be hearing from Alexander Connor on the Global Electric Mobility Program. And then in the end, we're going to have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Next slide, please. Yeah, so let me introduce the speakers for today, and I'll go first. So my name is Joel Desai. I'm a researcher at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, USA. I'm an electrical engineer by background. I work on various domestic and international projects in varying capacity. And NREL is the operating agent of some of the clean energy ministerial work streams. And I manage the Clean Energy Solutions Center at NREL, who is co-hosting this webinar. And I'll be moderating today's session, as well as would be giving a brief overview of the Solution Center. And as I mentioned, we'll be hearing from Sarbojit Pal, who will be giving the overview of the EVI initiative. So Sarbojit is a manager of partnerships at the Secretariat of the Clean Energy Ministerial, based in Paris, France. He supports various SEM initiatives related to themes of transportation, energy efficiency, industry, and clean fuels, such as hydrogen, and among others. He's currently responsible for the SEM's Electric Vehicle Initiative, EVI, and Global Drive to Zero campaign. And he has been instrumental in development of many other global initiatives on topics such as hydrogen, industry decarbonization, green procurement, among others, working with different multilateral institutions. And then we have Dai from CTCN, who would be giving the overview of CTCN, mentioned, and its program of work. So Dai supports the network and partnerships of the CTCN to strengthen the network by identifying innovative climate technology providers for potential network membership and providing online capacity building activities. She has expertise in energy poverty, rural electrification, and grid expansion. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Conley on the Global EV Outlook. So Elizabeth is an analyst in the Energy Technology Policy Division of the International Energy Agency, IEA. Her work includes transport scenario modeling, life cycle assessment, and techno-economic analysis. She was the lead author of the 2023 edition of the Global EV Outlook report and currently serves as the desk officer for the Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Technology Collaboration Program. And lastly, we will be hearing from Alexander Connor on the Global Electric Mobility Program. So Alexander is a program officer with the UN Environmental, leading UNEP's Electric Mobility Program. And prior to joining UNEP, he worked at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the International Energy Agency, IEA, and as a freelance consultant. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll be giving the overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. Next slide, please. So CESC is one of the initiatives under the Clean Energy Ministerial. The objective of the Solutions Center is to broadly accelerate the transition of clean energy market and technologies of the developing nations. This initiative is co-led by Australia and US, and NREL is the operating agent. We have got 40 partners to deliver services free of charge to the users to help developing countries to achieve the clean energy target and clean energy transitions. So please feel free to explore the website, which is listed here. And again, we'll share the slides with all of the participants. And you can see other work streams as well. And we offer kind of three main delivery or three services. Next slide, please. Yeah, so first service is Ask an Expert, which is considered the jewel of Clean Energy Solutions Center. So it is designed to help policymakers in developing nations, right, and our emerging economies to implement the clean energy policy and finance solutions. So we have more than 50 experts from over 15 countries, and to date, we have responded 300 plus requests submitted by 90 plus government. So that's the first service. And again, it's free of cost to the developing nations. The second service is training and capacity building, right? So we have delivered 300 webinars, training more than 20,000 public and private sector stakeholders. And the third service is resource library. We have over 1,500 curated reports, policy brief, journal articles, and again, it's free and publicly available. And again, if you have any questions on this, please feel free to reach out at jal.desai@enroll.gov. And now I will hand it to Sarbojit to talk about the EVI initiative. Sarbo.
Thank you, Jal. I hope I'm audible. Good.
Yes, you are.
Thanks. So I'll quickly kind of run through next, Holly, about the background of one of the flagship initiatives of the Clean Energy Ministerial, the Electric Vehicle Initiative, which we are, introducing today. It was established in 2010 as one of the first global initiatives on electric mobility. Today, it has 16 members, co-led by Canada, China, and the United States. The members currently account for over 85% of the global sales, and it brings together a combination of not just this government leadership, but also a significant amount of analysis and action. The initiative is coordinated by the International Energy Agency, and we'll hear from Elizabeth from the IEA about the work which is ongoing. But just as a context, including the Electric Vehicle Initiative within the SEM, we have currently 21 different other global initiatives. The other one, which Jal highlighted, is the Clean Energy Solution Center. In terms of now the activities that the Electric Vehicle Initiative has been carrying out over the last few years has been not just kind of the analytical and building action coalitions, but also bringing together a global community around electric mobility to to develop aspirational goals, targets for collective action. Next, Holly. If we see, some of these other partners, the list is quite illustrious. Almost kind of all the key players in the global, electric mobility space is involved or has been involved with the Electric Vehicle Initiative in some form or fashion, and that's not just from the international, institutions, groups, but also a large number of the industry and private sector is also kind of involved. And these coalitions come together under the two different initiatives. We have two different work streams that we have within the Clean Energy Ministerial, the Electric Vehicle Initiative and its nested campaign, the current Global Drive to Zero campaign. Collectively, take out analytical work in the form of the Global EV Outlook, and we'll hear about some of the highlights from the 2023 editions of the EV Outlook, but also the Global EV Data Explorer, which you can also explore on the IEA's website. And with the support of the coordinator for the Global Drive to Zero campaign, CalSTAT, we are also pushing forward with the Global Memorandum of Understanding on zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. Consequently, the results of all of this, including other global initiatives which are being kind of supported by actions of the Electric Vehicle Initiative, such as the Government Fleet Declaration, the EVI Pilot City Program, and so on and so forth. We are now starting to see results with regards to increased ambition and action for electric mobility. But in the last few years, we have also seen that it's not just electric mobility in the developed and economies where electric mobility is becoming real, but also in the emerging and developing countries. And that's why the Electric Vehicle Initiative has also been very supportive of the Global Environment Facility's Global E-Mobility Program, of which today we'll also hear from our colleagues in the UNEP. So that's just to give you a quick summary of what the Electric Vehicle Initiative is and what it is doing and supporting. And then I'll just kind of take you and introduce you to the upcoming 14th Clean Energy Ministerial and 8th Mission Innovation Meeting, which is the annual ministerial meeting of the Clean Energy Ministerial and the Mission Innovation, which is scheduled to take place between 19th to 22nd of July this year in Goa, which is next month. Next, please. And it is going to be featuring a host of different activities taking place back to back with the G20 Energy Transition Working Group and ministerial meetings. We have already about 80 plus side events and high-level roundtables which are planned, bringing together the energy community, but also a lot of the energy demand side communities, including that of transportation, with over 14 different events schedules just on transportation alone. Next, please. For the registration and details for the 14th Clean Energy Ministerial and 8th Mission Innovation are already available on the website semiindia.org. Please go and have a look at the website. And if you're intending to be in Goa and participating, please do register yourself as the registration now is open. So that's just to give you a quick summary of the electric vehicle initiative and also the upcoming ministerial meeting. And I'll hand back over to you, Jel. Thank you.
Thank you, Serbo. Dai, do you want to share your screen and give a brief overview about CTCN?
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Taye on behalf of the CTCN Director Rajiv. I'm very pleased to support this important webinar. And today I would like to give you a brief introduction to the CTCN and its new program of work. CTCN was established in 2013 under the UNFCCC Convention with a mandate to support developing countries realizing their climate commitments like NDCs by providing various technology solutions. The support we provide ranges all along the technology cycle from research and development to transfer, deployment, and dissemination. The country focal points submit their country requests to us, and we leverage our global network of 800 organizations to select a project implementer. We also work closely with Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and JEF to scale up our working solutions. Last year, we have released our new program of work for the next 5 years, and sustainable mobility was chosen as one of 5 areas that require system-wide transformations to support countries to become carbon neutral and climate resilient. Under this theme, CTCN has implemented 15 projects thus far, and the types of support merged into 2 common themes. First one was the development of national strategies for EVs, and the second, the feasibility studies for different modalities of electric vehicles. From our experience, I think today's webinar corresponds very well with the emerging technology needs of the developing countries. And I'm very excited to hear about today's discussion from experts from IEA and UNEP. With that, just before that, last but not least, please contact us for more information on how to engage with us as a network member or as a knowledge partner. With this, I will hand it over to Dr. Connelly for the EV outlet. Over to you, Dr. Connelly.
Great, thanks so much. Let me just try to share my slides. Oh, I think you have to quit sharing. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for the invitation to speak today. It's been a really exciting past year in kind of the outlook for EVs, and I think it's also an exciting time because this year marked exactly 10 years since the IEA first released a global EV outlook. That happened in 2013, and it wasn't an annual report at the time, but it was one that was kind of established in support, as we mentioned, of the Electric Vehicles Initiative. And at that time in 2013, the sales of electric cars were very low globally, so less than 0.5% of total sales, really, being a niche market. Electric cars were expensive, in particular their batteries, but several members of the Electric Vehicles Initiative kind of sets themselves some ambitious targets. Collectively, the objective of these countries was to reach a stock of 20 million electric vehicles on the road by 2020, which the IEA translated into a sales target of around 6 million electric cars being sold in 2020. And then ever since then, governments have been actively putting into place a wide range of policies to achieve these targets. This includes policies to improve vehicle fuel economy and reduce emissions, as well as financial support for purchase of electric vehicles and support for the manufacturing of batteries and electric vehicles as well. And this is in addition to kind of city level efforts that we've seen to incentivize the use of electric cars. And so the IEA has been supporting governments in this endeavor and tracking progress every year, sharing new analytical insights and examining different policy approaches. And so my presentation today will highlight some of the key findings from the 2023 edition of the Global EV Outlook. And so first I'll start with the trends in electric car sales. So we've seen, truly impressive growth in recent years, and sales stood at 6 million in 2021. And increased to over 10 million in 2022. And so you can see that we reached the stock target of 20 million electric cars last year and the sales target in 2021, which isn't too bad. Some things to note are that, the three largest car markets in general are China, Europe, and the United States, which together constitute about 60% of global car sales. And these happen to also be the largest electric car markets. And so I bring this up just to mention that, we may focus on these regions, but that's because what happens in these markets has pretty big repercussions for other countries as well. What you can see here is that China remains the largest electric vehicle market or electric car market by some distance. So 60% of global electric car sales were electric in China last year, 60% of all of the global electric car sales in the world last year were in China. So, and 29% of sales in China were electric cars, up from just 16% in 2021. And so what's impressive is this really, they'd set a target of hitting 20% electric car sales in 2025. And so in 2022, they already passed that by a significant margin. And today, half of the electric cars on the world's roads are in China. Europe is the second largest market, and we saw sales there last year increase by 15%, reaching about 1 in every 5 cars sold in Europe were electric. And then we can see the United States is somewhat lagging behind on electric car sales, but last year we saw a really strong uptick with 55% growth in electric car sales, reaching around an 8% sales share. And preliminary figures for this year suggest continued strong growth. Global electric car sales during the first quarter of this year were up 25% relative to the same period last year. In China, sales were more than 20% higher, in Europe 10%, and in the United States, they were 60% higher than Q1 2022. And so our expectation for 2023 is for this trend to continue and electric car sales to reach 14 million by the end of the year, which would constitute about 18% of all cars sold. In emerging markets, sales of electric cars remain generally low. Electric cars tend to be expensive for most consumers there, and we see in general that motorcycles are a more prevalent means of transport. For example, the top EV company by revenue in India is Ola, and it doesn't even sell cars, so it's just selling electric two-wheelers. Despite that, we saw a boom last year in electric car sales in India, Indonesia, and Thailand. In India, 90% of this was led by their leading domestic automaker Tata. But in Indonesia and Thailand, part of this increase can be explained by Chinese car makers entering the market with some fairly cheap electric car models. We can expect to see a continuing increase in these countries as all three have put into place some sort of support schemes for electric vehicles, such as India's production-linked incentive schemes. Elsewhere, sales remain relatively low, but there are some interesting trends to watch in Latin America and Southeast Asia. But as I mentioned, in most cases, motorcycle electrification is happening there quicker and is an interesting trend to watch. So moving from sales to the types of models being sold, we found that large models and SUVs really dominated global car sales last year. In China and Europe, 40 to 45% of electric car sales were either large cars or SUVs, which is about the global average. And you can see it's in China where we actually see the smallest and cheapest cars available. In the United States, there are hardly any small electric cars, and large cars and SUVs make up about 70% of electric car sales. And I'm mentioning all of this because the size of the vehicle has very important implications for critical minerals demand. So for example, we calculated that the average battery electric SUV in Europe is twice as heavy as a small model and requires up to 75% more critical minerals. Of course, we aren't saying that electric SUVs are all bad. They're still certainly preferable to non-electric SUVs. But talking about ICEs, to compare, the EVs aren't really that different. So over 60% of ICE car sales were large cars and SUVs last year. And part of this is because car makers can generate greater returns from larger models. And so they have an incentive to focus on these. So as sales of electric cars increase, global spending is increasing accordingly. Last year, total spending on electric cars, this is excluding charging, so really focusing on car purchases. The total spending increased by 50% and reached around 425 billion US dollars. And most of this money is spent by individuals or companies buying cars, while the rest of it, around 10%, is spent by governments through things like subsidies. You can see that the share of government support stood at over 20% when electric cars were still emerging, but it has been decreasing as subsidies in major markets have been dropping. And looking forward, we can expect consumer spending to continue to increase significantly. However, with public spending, we think it could stabilize as major markets have cut subsidies, such as China and Europe. And while we might see others ramping up subsidies, for example, in India and other emerging markets, we think that kind of all could balance out and we might remain around 10% government spending into the future. Okay, but this transition isn't just about cars. So it's important to look at electric vehicles, not just cars. And one example I think that highlights the importance of looking outside of cars is that more than 35% of road transport CO2 emissions come from heavy duty vehicles like buses and trucks. And on the flip side, in Asian countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, we can see 2- and 3-wheelers consuming as much gasoline as cars do. So transport electrification in these modes will be needed in particular to help achieve this kind of net zero target by 2050. For 2- and 3-wheelers, as we see with cars, we're kind of already at this mass market stage with above 15% market share globally. To compare, for buses at the global level, we're approaching around 5% market share. And this is encouraging because it's showing we're really entering a phase of early market adoption, especially where there is strong support at the local level. But the next frontier for electrification is medium and heavy duty trucks. As is the case for 2-wheelers and buses, China led in electric truck sales in 2022 with around 50,000 sales, about 85% of global sales. And I think, China's dominance of electric buses, trucks, and 2-, 3-wheeler markets today tells us a couple things. So I think the first is that there are still some significant market opportunities in most countries for domestic companies to seize. So as mentioned, take, for example, the company Ola, India's top EV company by revenue, which makes electric 2-wheelers. Entering the car market offers a good opportunity for them to kind of expand their coverage within India. And, I think from the Chinese story, we can also see that strong policy support, significant involvement of subnational level governments as well, so at the province or city level, and the right mix of incentives can really help push bus and truck electrification. And finally, a strong policy push will be decisive in the race to electrify medium and heavy duty trucks. And luckily, we're beginning to see kind of more policy ambition on this front, especially in Europe and the US. So moving on, we can look at charging infrastructure. And so, when it comes to charging infrastructure trends, currently, most charging demand is met by home chargers, but publicly accessible chargers are really crucial to enable wider EV adoption. At the end of 2022, there were 2.7 million public chargers worldwide, an increase of 55% compared to 2021, showing that this public charger stock has kept pace with EV adoption, at least on a global level. While China is home to half of the electric light-duty vehicles, it represents 2/3 of public charging stock. And in Chinese cities, and even more generally, just in dense urban areas across the world, access to home charging is more limited, and thus there is this greater need for public charging points. And here you can see that the number of public chargers per EV can vary widely between countries. On a global basis, there are about 10 electric light-duty vehicles for every public charger. In China, that number is closer to 8. And then in Korea, there's actually a public charging point for every 2 electric vehicles. While on the other end of the spectrum, we see New Zealand has almost 100 electric vehicles per public charging point. I think in general, we expect the public kind of charging point to EV ratio to be higher in kind of these nascent markets to help encourage EV adoption. And the point here, I'm showing charging point coverage can also be considered in terms of charging capacity per electric vehicle. And I think this metric kind of better accounts for the fact that fast chargers can deliver more energy over the same amount of time and thus charge more vehicles per day. And so this is just to highlight that governments should be considering kind of both aspects of coverage and charging infrastructure strategies in order to help support the electric vehicle transition. Moving now to some trends in batteries. So from the beginning of 2021 to the end of last year, the prices of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel increased dramatically. At their peak, lithium carbonate prices were 6 times higher than that, higher than their average over the period from, I think, 2015 to 2020. And, this is the result of kind of several factors, including supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen, battery prices declining for around a decade, but due to this recent price volatility in mineral prices, the average price of lithium-ion battery packs increased for the first time in 2022. But, nonetheless, prices remain at a fraction of what they used to be just a few years ago. And so not all battery chemistries were impacted to the same degree. We saw the strongest relative increase of about 25% with lithium iron phosphate batteries, compared to less than a 15% increase for NMC variants. And this is because the price of LFP batteries is more dependent on fluctuations in prices of lithium. Nonetheless, though, lithium iron phosphate batteries remain one of the cheapest battery chemistries available today. And so I just wanted to show this slide, highlighting that battery chemistries today rely mostly on 3 key elements: lithium, cobalt, and nickel. And here you can see the amount of each mineral needed per kilowatt hour of battery capacity for some of the more common cathode chemistries. A few years ago, nickel, cobalt, aluminum batteries were the most popular chemistry due to their kind of superior energy density. But the thing is, they're expensive to produce. And you can also see that the second most popular alternative was nickel manganese cobalt 333, which is quite mineral intensive. And so with the increase in cobalt prices in the last decade, both of those have kind of been replaced by a succession of chemistries containing less and less cobalt. And then, lithium iron phosphate batteries, despite their lower energy density, are also gaining popularity thanks to the use of cheaper and more abundant materials, such as iron and phosphorus, compared to nickel and cobalt. And finally, in 2023, we're also seeing a new type of battery entering the market, mainly in China, and these are sodium-ion batteries, which actually eliminate the use of lithium altogether. But because of their kind of even lower energy density compared to LFP batteries, they're kind of best suited for applications with low range needs and kind of a need for a most cost-effective vehicle. And so quickly, I kind of, just want to touch on policies, but I think just to highlight that along with this report published online, we also have a EV Policy Explorer that has a kind of a wide breadth of policies related to electric vehicles. And so today I'll just kind of touch on kind of some of the big announcements in 2022 and the trends we're seeing there. And so I think that one of the most major policy announcements of 2022 was the Inflation Reduction Act, which touched on aspects of light and heavy duty electric vehicle electrification, and aspects including mineral supply, manufacturing, corporate and consumer incentives, and charging. So I think most notably for consumers to receive the clean vehicle tax credit, the requirements on battery mineral sourcing, either coming from North America or a US free trade partner, as well as battery and vehicle domestic manufacturing or North American manufacturing or assembling requirements. So all of this really trying to increase the incentive to manufacture electric vehicles and their components in the US. And what's interesting is we're also seeing, other regions kind of take this more comprehensive approach. And so kind of in the EU, as part of their Green Deal industrialization plan, they've implemented kind of a suite of complementary policies addressing supply, manufacturing, and demand. This includes regulating vehicle CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as allowing EV manufacturers kind of greater access to funding, skills, and different markets, and implementing critical mineral policy. And at the same time, also increasing targets with respect to charging. And so I think most notably out of the EU, we've seen this kind of goal to be able to meet almost 90% of their electric vehicle battery demand from within the union by 2030. And so, I think over the past few years, there have been other, policies from other regions that looking at how to address the supply side of the electric vehicle transition, and at the same time looking at the demand side. And so I think taking this overall approach is something that a lot of countries are trying to kind of come at it from all angles recently. And so, I think these are just some examples of a clear attempt to comprehensively and simultaneously cover all aspects of the EV ecosystem. And I think, it's only fair to note that this is kind of following the trend of what we've seen with China, whose policy has been kind of a more cohesive set from the start. Okay, but with that, this kind of brings me to our expectations or the outlook for electric cars. And if there's anything to learn from the experiences made with electric car sales over the past decade that I referred to earlier, I think there's two things. And the first is that setting targets is kind of the first part of the transformation. And such targets often look, really ambitious and hard to achieve in practice at the time of their announcement. But, and this is the second lesson, they should absolutely be taken seriously. So over the past decade, governments have shown that they follow up on their targets through policy implementation, step by step, year after year. And so this outlook is really not short of ambition. So many countries have formulated net zero emissions targets for mid-century, and within that context, put forward ambitious targets either to phase out the sales of internal combustion engine vehicles or to achieve 100% sales of zero emission vehicles, often as soon as 2035. And so on aggregate, these targets imply that electric car sales must reach around 40% by 2030. And that's kind of indicated here with the label APS, which is our announced pledges scenario. And so I want to kind of take a step back and look at what our expectation in last year's edition of the Global EV Outlook was. And so we see that the share of electric cars we thought at that time by 2030 would reach around 22% on the basis of the policies that were in place at that time. So there was still quite some gap between stated policies and announced targets. But things have evolved really quickly over the past year. And so we've made kind of three notable revisions to our outlook. The first is in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, as I mentioned, and that's combined with the adoption of California's new zero emission vehicle regulation and its adoption by a number of states. And we project that to deliver a 50% market share for electric cars in 2030, which is in line with Biden's target. And, I think the recently proposed emission standards from the US EPA would even, further support the achievement of this share and boost it further. The European Union also adopted CO2 standards for cars and vans that are aligned with the goals set out in their Fit for 55 package. And this led us to revise up the share of electric cars in total sales to around 60% for Europe as a whole by 2030. And then in China, we're actually seeing subsidies for electric cars being phased out, but local support remains strong and the market fundamentals for EVs there are good. So electric cars are generally cheaper and more competitive with internal combustion cars in China than it is in other markets. And so this leads us to expect that electric cars could achieve a sales share of more than 60% in 2030 in China. And so as a result, in this year's outlook at the global level, we expect that the share of electric cars could reach 35% in 2030 under existing policies, which you can see is getting, much closer to what government targets would imply. And the implications of such a transformation of the passenger car market are far-ranging for the car industry and its associated supply chain, as well as for oil markets. So as mentioned earlier, passenger cars constitute roughly half of oil demand from road transport and have been a source of demand growth for decades. But electric vehicles are kind of set to change that. And we estimate that the amount of oil demand that's set to be avoided through the use of electric vehicles by 2030 is over 5 million barrels per day. And again, that's predominantly through the use of electric cars. Of course, there are many uncertainties in the outlook for electric cars, as there kind of always are, such as the economic outlook on whether policy support gets sustained as markets grow and whether mass markets can really be reached, as well as, will infrastructure follow at the required place and much, much more. But, I think there's as much, if not more, reason to be optimistic on the outlook for electric cars than what is kind of shown in the current policies and government targets. My reason for such optimism comes from developments kind of within the industry. So we've been tracking announcements from car makers around the world over the past couple of years and looking at what they mean for the number of electric cars that could be sold in 2030. And we've seen these targets increase a lot in recent years, and they suggest now that electric cars could make up for around 40 to 55% of total car sales by 2030. And this is actually very close to the 60% that are required globally to be on track for our net zero by 2050 pathway. And it's certainly above the levels that are implied by current government ambitions. And so, many car makers are actually looking to massively, if not fully, electrify cars within the next 1 to 2 decades. And we can expect smaller and cheaper electric cars already by 2025, making them more affordable to consumers in the mass market. Of course, ambitions of the car industry are one thing, and whether the entire electric vehicle supply chain can be built up on time is another. But I think here too, there's good news coming from industry announcements. So looking at batteries, there are about 1.6 terawatt hours of manufacturing capacity in place globally last year. And with expansion announcements that have been made by the battery industry, this number could reach close to 7 terawatt hours in 2030. And that's pretty fairly aligned with what is required to meet this 60% EV sales share in our net zero scenario. And so I think, that's really encouraging signs. And so with that, I'll just want to conclude with some policy recommendations. And the first policy recommendation we have is, to continue adapting support for electric cars as the market matures. And so this means you can, perhaps discontinue purchase subsidies, as we've seen in some countries, but support should continue in some other form, perhaps by supporting public charging infrastructure, which brings me to the second recommendation, which is to continue expanding EV charging infrastructure to enable kind of the further adoption of EVs, particularly within population segments that don't have access to home charging. In addition to the chargers themselves, investments will be needed for grid upgrades to support this charging infrastructure. And I think that's, particularly important for heavy-duty vehicle charging. And just more generally, policymakers should employ mechanisms, perhaps financial incentives or heavy-duty emission standards like we've seen in the EU, to help kickstart the electrification of the heavy-duty market. It's also important that EV adoption is promoted in emerging and developing economies. And so there are promising dynamics for 2- and 3-wheelers and buses in developing countries, but the sales of electric vehicles overall have picked up kind of only very slowly for cars. And then finally, I think the last thing is that it's essential to develop the EV supply chain, without which the EV transition isn't possible. So while announcements on battery manufacturing capacity are promising, all stages of this supply chain need to be considered, and investments need to be made today in order to build out the supply chain, and then also to promote development of innovative technologies. So that includes things like alternative battery chemistries, all of this to help ensure secure, resilient, and sustainable EV supply chains into the future. And so with that, I'm probably over time, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Alexander to talk about the Global Electric Mobility Program.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you. My name is Alex Körner. I'm leading UNEP's Global Electric Mobility Program. I think it's going to be interesting because I'm going to cover a fairly different perspective when it comes to e-mobility and what is needed in the world. And I'm now turning on to share my slides. I think you should all see them now.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Yep. Should be the case now.
Yep, now we can see them.
Okay, very good. So I am going to tell you more about UNEP's Global Electric Mobility Program, what we are doing, how we try to support low and middle income countries all over the world with the shift to electric mobility. Maybe before doing so, I'm going to give a little bit of a motivation. If you look at the growth of global vehicle fleet, and that chart just shows light duty vehicles between, let's say, 2005 and 2050, then what is very important to see is that almost all of the growth is coming in from non-OECD countries. Now, non-OECD countries, of course, also including very big economies like China, like India, the BRICS. But basically, the key message is that all countries need to be supported if we want to achieve a sustainable transport sector. All countries, meaning Southeast Asian countries, meaning the African continent, meaning Latin America, meaning the small island development states. Basically, everybody has their role to play to achieve a sustainable transport sector. If you look at global emissions from the transport sector, if we are not doing anything, which is shown by the red line, then obviously, or if you just go ahead with what is implemented so far, then obviously CO2 emissions are going to grow. If we use the full potential, which is with let's say increasing efficiency of conventional vehicles, then we follow probably something like the blue line. If we go for full electrification, we follow a green line. If we really want to go for a 90% decarbonization of the transport sector, then we follow the full green line. This is just to say basically all solutions need to be incorporated, not only technology, but also avoid, also shift, also improve, basically all options we have, and all countries need to be contributing to this. Now, this basically leads us to our UNEP Electric Mobility Program. Maybe I'm telling a little bit more about where we're based and what we're doing. So I'm part of Sustainable Mobility Unit. That's a technical support unit, currently having a bit more than 20 staff, being based in Nairobi, but also having staff in Bangkok, having staff in Bogota. So we are supporting the technical side on the implementation of UNEP's Global Electric Mobility Program, but then on the managerial side, there are many more people involved, being part on the chef unit of UNEP. This is just to say that there are quite a couple of persons working in UNEP on supporting countries with the shift to electric mobility. Why is that? So currently the program is working in about 50 low and middle income countries. That is going to be increased to a bit more than 60 once the GEF 8 program is approved. We're having these 50 country projects, and I'm going to tell you much more in a second about what we are doing in these country projects. To support the countries, we are having we have put in place a structure which is operational on the regional and on the global level. On the regional level, we're having 4 so-called regional support and investment platforms, one in Africa, which is basically managed by UNEP, one in Asia and the Pacific, which is managed by the Asian Development Bank, one in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is managed by Centro de Movilidad Sostenible together with UNEP, and one in Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia and Middle East, which is managed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The sort of two main objectives of these platforms is to organize meetings where all e-mobility projects in the region should meet on a biannual basis, bringing basically all these either technical specialists or government specialists or those people working in, let's say, bus operating companies, bringing them together, providing capacity building events, doing trainings, giving them the possibility to basically exchange their views on the e-mobility projects, but then also organizing events whereby we try to bring together, let's say, financiers for e-mobility projects with cities and national government representatives looking for opportunities to develop e-mobility projects, and also the industry to basically supply their products and get an idea how the market is developing and what is needed, and in a more advanced stage also from the project side, trying to aggregate that demand, trying to aggregate, let's say, orders for electric buses across cities or across regions, or sort of agreeing on some minimal technical standards which can be coordinated in order to facilitate better prices from the industry. That's one of the ideas where these regional support and investment platforms shall play a role. On the global side, the project has so far put in place 4 global thematic working groups. They are implemented together with the International Energy Agency. There's one on electric light-duty vehicles, one on electric 2- and 3-wheelers, one electric heavy-duty vehicles, and then one on charging infrastructure, batteries, and grid integration. Here, the idea is to first compile knowledge products and make them available through the large network of partners which are working on all aspects of e-mobility, including the IEA, including TUMI e-bus mission, including C40, including ITTP, including WRI, including a lot of partners, and making these products available through what we call the global e-mobility toolbox. And the other sort of purpose of these working groups is to provide for networking opportunities, to basically give all sort of stakeholders an idea what is going on in different areas, in different regions. Now, by now, that global electric mobility program is implementing more than 70, close to $80 million. With the GEF 8 contribution, that will be more than $100 million. Of this $100 million, about 50% are sort of managed by UNEP. The other half is managed by project partners such as other UN agencies, UNDP, UNIDO, or development banks like ADB, EBRD, or partners like the Urban Electric Mobility Initiative under the Solutions Plus program. I think it's sort of fair to say that that program is maybe the biggest program addressing low and middle income countries. Of course, a big share of the funding is actually coming from the Global Environment Facility, and I'm going to talk about this the CHEF program and also the opportunities under the CHEF program a bit later in my presentation. When we're talking about country projects, so what is actually being done in these country projects? And now this is specifically true for those projects financed by the Global Environment Facility. We have about 32 CHEF-funded national e-mobility projects in the program right now. They are ranging from sort of very small project sizes being $500,000 to large projects up to $6 million. Very often they're structured very similarly. We support these countries through the implementation of these funds with building capacity and creating awareness, with establishing roadmaps and strategies, basically giving the or supporting governments in their effort to develop the planning instruments to know where they want to go and to develop targets and milestones and whatnot. Through these CHEF projects, there's a lot of work on policy development going on there, making sure that technical standards are in place to regulate, for example, safety of charging infrastructure, to look into what is necessary when it comes to regulating charging connections, looking into regulations when it comes to vehicle importation. Yeah? Is the system ready to reach the electric vehicles? But then we're also, of course, looking into fiscal policies. How can incentives be provided? For example, is there a way to reduce or waive certain import taxes or levies for electric vehicles for a certain period of time or a certain amount of vehicles to basically close that gap when it comes to purchase price of electric vehicles versus conventional vehicles. We're also looking into creation of business models, looking into development of financial schemes. Why business models? In our work in low and middle income countries, we very much focus on fleet vehicles, be that electric 2- and 3-wheelers for taxi services or for delivery services, be that light-duty vehicles in taxi or ride-hailing services, be that vans in minibus services, be that bus systems in either regular or paratransit activities, or delivery vans. But basically, the idea is to really focus on fleet vehicles. Why? Of course, fleet vehicles for the time being are the most economic viable application for electric vehicles, clearly because of their intense use and basically therefore creating much more benefits when it comes to lower fuel costs and operational costs of electric vehicles during their use time. And secondly, also looking at fleet vehicles, of course, has an implication when it comes to charging infrastructure. I mean, if we're looking at the African continent, then having a sort of dense public charging networks for individual use of private vehicles is maybe a couple of years ahead, but providing fleet vehicles with sort of discrete mission profiles and those vehicles being maybe standing in depots overnight or something like this, providing the charging infrastructures for this sort of use application that is very much feasible within low and middle income countries. And this is the sort of applications we are supporting. And lastly, we are also looking into piloting electric vehicles on the ground. Virtually all of the CHEF-funded projects, they have an investment component whereby we look into, let's say, piloting the first 2-3 electric buses, or a fleet of 50 electric motorcycles, or maybe 20-30 electric 3-wheelers. Now, these pilot projects, they have, of course, a very important awareness and capacity creating element. And that's why we are doing it. And this is also something I believe which countries appreciate, that it's not only about technical assistance, not only about producing paper, but it's also about doing something tangible on the ground. that slide provides an overview about the countries the program is currently active in, and also, let's say, the main developing partner which is in charge of those projects. As you can see, there's really a pretty big portfolio on the African continent. But equally, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of projects going on in the Asia and Pacific area, also in Central Eastern Europe, West Asia, Middle East, and of course in Latin America and in the Caribbean. Now, of course, all these projects are very, very different. There are different countries in different regions of the world are very different stages of development of e-mobility applications. Some of the countries are very, very strong on the EV manufacturing side, especially when it comes to 2- and 3-wheelers. Other in many African countries, for example, really by covering public transport, public transport fleet operations, a very large share of actual passenger kilometers can be cleaned up, can be decarbonized, can be cleaned up in a way to contribute to less air pollution, can be made more efficient with regards to less fuel imports, all these sort of things. So we believe that there's actually a very big potential in low and middle income countries to work on electric mobility and to introduce the relevant vehicles in their fleets. Now, I just would like to provide a little example how such a JEF project is usually structured. I just picked one more or less randomly. It's a JEF 7 funded e-mobility project in Sierra Leone. Objective is to support Sierra Leone with the shift to electric mobility. Executing agency is the Environmental Protection Agency in Sierra Leone. Now, the very nice things about, for example, these JEF-funded projects is that there's staff on the ground managing the projects over the time period of that project. So, like for 4 years, there will be a project manager working only on that project. Now, that is really very helpful because through this, we can sort of ensure that there's very close relationship with government, with the different ministries, with sort of ensuring that the policies which are designed, developed in such a project have a very high chance to actually getting adopted at the end of the day. In the case of Sierra Leone, the JEF agency is UNEP. Now, this is a JEF specialty. If you want to use global environment funds, then you need to use an implementing agency as sort of the highest level of project management in such a setup. That can be UNEP, that can be UNDP, that can be UNIDO. There's about 18 agencies all over the world which basically make the link between the JEF and the country. Now, in the case of Sierra Leone, we're looking at a project which has about $420,000 over 4 years for project activities. So that's a very small project, but we believe that still with relative constrained amount of resources, we can do a lot. And what we actually do in such a project, or what EPASL is managing with the help of consultants, with the help of international experts, with the help of local experts, with the help of local universities, with the support of UNEP, what they're actually doing is working on 4 components. And many of these JEF-funded electric mobility projects, they are actually developed in a similar way. Component 1 is very often called something around institutionalization of low-carbon electric mobility. And the idea is here really to develop a national e-mobility strategy, basically developing a government document, an agreed document which defines milestones, which defines targets. Where does Sierra Leone want to be in 2030, 2035, maybe 2040 with regards to electric mobility on the different modes, looking into 2- and 3-wheelers, looking into cars, looking into buses, looking into EV charging infrastructure, identifying all sort of policy gaps which will need to be closed, proposing financing models, these sort of things that is lined out in these strategies. Similarly, under this institutionalization component, we suggest that a national coordination body, which basically coordinates activities among several ministries on the topic of e-mobility is established. I believe that is a very important activity, because we see that transport has links to very many ministries. It's not only Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure, but it is Ministry of Energy. It is, of course, Ministry of Finance or Treasury or whatever it's called in the different countries. It has to do with industry policies. It has to do with developing curricula for local training of either mechanics or for universities, whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, and throughout the projects, we want to create coordinating institutions which basically bring all these ministries and the relevant persons together, maybe on a 3-monthly basis, so that everybody is in the loop what is going on and things are going to be more coordinated. The Sierra Leone e-mobility project has a component on low carbon e-mobility demonstration. Here, the idea is to bring on the road maybe the first 20 electric three-wheelers. They're called kekes in Sierra Leone. It's basically about preparing the demonstration project, providing a subsidy to a private sector stakeholder to actually purchase the vehicles, use them under the project maybe for a period of 18 months, and then, of course, keeping on using them in the fleet. The policy component is often called around the lines like preparation of scale-up and the replication of electric mobility. Here, the idea is basically to get the policy framework right and to develop some business models and finance schemes for various operation modes of electric vehicles. In the case of Sierra Leone, that means looking into all transport sector related policies, looking into fiscal policies, looking into policies with regards to regulation of the energy market, and whether, for example, a third party is able to sell electricity through a charging point and measure it in kilowatt hours. These are policy activities. On the financing side. It's about looking into, for example, developing a loan scheme with a local commercial bank, and in combination maybe with a international development bank, and to see whether a system can be developed to make financing accessible to the end consumer for, let's say, electric three-wheelers in this case. And then lastly, these projects usually look into also the long-term environmental sustainability of low-carbon electric mobility. And here it's basically two things: looking into how renewable energies can be integrated in e-mobility applications, and second thing is to already deal with the issue of battery end of life, and yeah, that aspect of e-mobility will gain much more importance and much more traction under GEF 8. Now, I would like to walk you through briefly using 2 slides on a case study. I use Kenya as a country, reason for which is that in Kenya probably we have the longest track record to work on vehicle efficiency and then subsequently electric mobility. So policy work in Kenya started basically under the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, of which IEA is also a partner. Starting with making an inventory what sort of vehicles are coming to the country. We call this fuel economy baseline that has been established for Kenya in the year 2014, and basically captures a snapshot at vehicle imports, mapping them on the model, on the engine basis to tested fuel economies, and basically looking into what is the average weighted fuel economy of all vehicles coming to Kenya in a certain year. Now, Kenya did that exercise starting with data in 2010 and updating it in 2018 again. And by this, basically, you get an idea how fleet efficiency in Kenya evolves. Now, based on this baseline and on the knowledge what you get into the country, you can now think with the country on what sort of policies you want to work. So in Kenya, that sort of set of policies which has been developed and adopted with regards to vehicle efficiency started with introducing an age limit for the used imported vehicles. I mean, on the African continent, I think it's fair to say that maybe with the exception of South Africa, most sub-Saharan countries have maybe 90–95% shares of used vehicles in new registrations. So basically, if you want to increase efficiency of these vehicles, setting an age limit makes much sense. That has been set in Kenya already in 2005. Then a fuel quality standard had been introduced, basically adopting Euro 4 fuels for the entire East African community in 2015. Now, on the vehicle emission side, that has been basically complemented by saying, okay, only Euro 4 vehicles are allowed in the East African community, and that is effective as of January 2023. Now, this is just to say that electric mobility policies do not start with electric mobility policies only, but basically starting with how can you generally increase your vehicle efficiency. Now, based on that work on vehicle efficiency, UNEP and other partners in Kenya then supported the development of multiple other policies, that goes hand in hand with, for example, a series of technical reports on e-mobility, which had been done with a local partner. In this case, it's the Energy and Petroleum Regulation Agency in Kenya. This work led then to basically the introduction of a set of standards. So far, Kenya has, I believe, adopted 24 e-mobility specific ISO standards on safety, on specifications on vehicles, on testing of vehicles, on hybrid electric vehicles, on mopeds and motorcycles, and that is basically a first set of standards and regulations which sort of controls and governs what is possible in Kenya and what is not. With this work of UNEP and partners supported then the introduction of fiscal incentives. So, for example, in 2019, import duty for electric vehicles had been halved. We then worked together with local partners to do an analysis or a cost-benefit analysis, what is basically the value of foregone taxes versus reduced fossil fuel imports. Now, this is a very important sort of point for many low and middle-income countries importing fuels. Importing fuels means spending dollars. Selling this fuel in local currency has a huge impact on foreign exchange balances, can create huge problems in many countries. So basically every liter which is not imported to a country but which is based on using locally generated electricity for transport has an immediate effect. Now, working on these sort of issues, doing some cost-benefit analysis basically led, in the case of Kenya, that some policy proposals to waive or reduce various taxes for electric vehicles, or for electric vehicle supply equipment, or for lithium-ion batteries are now very close to adoption. Similarly, in Kenya, we're working right now on developing a national e-mobility strategy that will support a national e-mobility policy, and this will be basically the overarching planning document for Kenya for the next couple of years, where and how to proceed with e-mobility. In parallel to this, UNEP has supported a little pilot with 50 electric motorcycles in 4 different fleets that happened 2021 to 2022. And now, of course, reality is very much different. There's about 15 companies in Kenya working on electric vehicles. There's maybe 1,000 electric motorcycles so far on the road. Various companies providing either swapping or fixed charging services. Of course, still all very small scale, but it can evolve very quickly. Now, the takeaway is basically it needs a holistic approach, targeting the topic of e-mobility from all sides: awareness, capacity, strategy, policy and regulation, fiscal incentives, financial business, piloting. Everything needs to be included. Now, that is basically responding a little bit to the question, what is the paradigm shift? The paradigm shift should be in bringing pragmatic approaches to low and middle income countries when it comes to the introduction to electric mobility. Yeah? Replicate lessons learned from other countries, either with regards to strategy, with regards to policy and regulation, with regards to business and finance, supporting the development of bankable projects, aggregate EV and EV supply equipment demand, work on used electric vehicles, battery end of life and circularity, link it to last mile connectivity, link it to active mobility, link it to digitalization. Basically also work together on the global scale by facilitating some sort of coordinated approach when it comes to funding e-mobility projects, and also on the other side, feed bottom-up results into top-down political processes. Yeah? And this has much to do with developing targets, that has much to do with other initiatives like the zero emission vehicle Transition Council, where IEA and UNEP and other partners are also playing an active role. And yeah, this is basically what we want to now scale up through our GEF 8 program. I have one slide to go, then I'm done. That's basically now talking a little bit about funding opportunities. I mentioned earlier that UNEP and partners have been working on developing a new global electric mobility program under the 8th GEF cycle. I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty high chance that this is going to be approved. Now, there will be possibilities to develop country projects and submit them within a second round of submissions to the GEF. We don't know so far when this second round of submissions will be, but there's a pretty high chance that this second round of submission will come. Now, what are sort of the main steps to untap global environment facility funding for national e-mobility projects? Basically, most important step is to work on a coordinated process within the country, whereby you as a government define how do you want to use your GEF resources. Yeah, I mean, they can be used for climate change, they can be used for land degradation, they can be used for biodiversity. There's pretty much competition around these resources, and basically that programming approach, whether or not there's a desire to do an electric mobility project, that basically is led by the GEF focal point. And now that GEF focal point also at some point would be the one who issues a letter to an implementing agency such as UNEP, whether or not a certain amount of budget shall be blocked into for a electric mobility project. Then the next step would be the preparation of a concept note. That concept note would be submitted to the GEF. That concept note will be reviewed, is eventually approved. Once such a concept note is approved, a project preparation grant will be issued by the GEF, which allows then the development of the full project documents, similar to what I showed for the Sierra Leone example. And this is a process which takes about a year. And then the project can be submitted for CEO endorsement. Once this is done, then it probably takes another half year until projects become operational, and then project execution starts. So yeah, this is an invitation to those being on this webinar to think about whether this is interesting or not. UNEP and other GEF implementing agencies are very happy to support such a process. And I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you all the participants for sticking around. So we have got some interesting questions in the chat. So I'll start with the first one. So this question is for you, Elizabeth. So out of those 5 policy recommendations that you mentioned, which one do you think is the most challenging moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, picking one I think is quite difficult. My first instinct, at least personally, I feel like charging infrastructure and particularly kind of the grid upgrades that will be required is pretty challenging moving forward. And this is kind of based on some things I've heard from, I guess, more developed countries where there can be kind of really long queues to be able to kind of add a grid connection or upgrade a grid, especially kind of the more local distribution grids. And so to me, that one seems like it could be difficult to overcome. Just there's a lot of kind of bureaucracy also involved, I think. yeah, I think the other one that I mentioned is supply chains, and I see some questions kind of related to that. So I do want to touch on that just briefly to kind of check some others off. But I think, you know, certainly there are risks to the supply chain. You know, there's really long lead times, I think up to 20 years to open a new mine for battery minerals. But at least to me, I think there, you know, with innovative chemistries on the rise and kind of the idea of right sizing batteries and, you know, reducing the size of a battery in a vehicle where you're not really driving it all that far every day, so you can have a lower range battery. And then recycling, of course, can really all help with kind of the, you know, concerns about mineral availability. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and stop there then.
Perfect. Thanks, Elizabeth. So the other question, and it's for both of you, right? Like, what are the best practices to promote EVs in developing countries, and what lessons they can learn?
I think Alexander will do a better job than me, but I'll just say a couple of things. You know, to me, I do see a lot of opportunity. There was also kind of this question about building awareness in emerging and developing economies. And I think, you know, the electrification of these motorbikes or even three-wheelers is something that I think can really start, you know, spreading the word about how electrification doesn't necessarily interrupt your daily, you know, habits and commuting patterns. And so, you know, I think there are some things like this that, you know, are very different from some of the more developed countries. And so there are opportunities to kind of leverage these. And, you know, I think already with 2- and 3-wheelers, there's kind of cost benefits, advantages for electric vehicles. And so to me, those can really kind of help pave the way. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, you know, I feel like there were questions about building out the grid, especially in emerging and developing economies, to help support EVs. And I think, you know, certainly that's a challenge, but I almost see it also as an opportunity in countries where they're, you know, currently already, you know, developing their grid and building it out and planning for this. And so making sure, you know, they're thinking about an electric future can really, you know, then they can just start incorporating that into their current plans. And it's not kind of building onto an existing network, but it's as you're already building your network, incorporating, you know, additional power supply for electric vehicles.
Thanks a lot. Alexander, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, definitely creating awareness is very important. Secondly, I would say is, so in the 2- and 3-wheeler segment, if you look over the lifetime of the vehicles already, the electric options are much cheaper than the conventional options. It is just that the one-off investment cost at the very beginning pose a very big barrier for somebody who has very limited resources. And for example, for the time being, I'd say the price spread is maybe, or the price differential is maybe still as high as maybe $500 to $800 or something like this. Now, I think what is really important is to bring on board fiscal incentives to get this to get the purchase price gap smaller, and this certainly will lead to a situation whereby we see a critical mass of electric motorcycles on the road. I mean, just to say, I was in Togo 3 weeks ago, and in Togo there's a company which now is operating close to 3,000 electric motorcycles in the country. And Togo is a very small country. They probably aim to have something like 6,000-7,000 electric motorcycles on the road by the end of the year. Togo itself imports only like 40,000 motorcycles as a whole per year. Yeah? So now, for example, this is already a market share more than 10% over 1 year. Yeah. Now, what I can say is that that is not demonstration anymore. That is not piloting anymore. That is sort of a commercial phase. Yeah? And that just started, or that company basically started developing the market on a larger scale only in September last year. Just to mention that this transition can actually go quite fast once a certain tipping point is achieved. Yeah? And I think it's really important to bring financial instruments to align it with the policies to actually get that critical mass on the road, so that the technology is visible and the technology is perceived by those using them as a viable thing, as a reliable technology, as something which creates more money in the pocket of the motorcycle driver at the end of the day. And I think that's the most important. That's the thing that counts.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think you both briefly touched upon this one, but if you can elaborate that, Great. So what are the best practices of business models and financing schemes employed in developing countries to accelerate the growth of EV?
So maybe I'll make one comment here. You know, in this year's Global EV Outlook, for the first time, we kind of looked at battery swapping business models. And I think, you know, to Alexander's point about, especially in emerging and developing economies, the purchase price can be a really big barrier. And so one thing that battery swapping has done, so for those that, you know, aren't familiar, battery swapping, you know, is basically, instead of trying to charge your vehicle with a cable, you can go to a swap station and they'll put in a replenished battery and take your depleted battery. And with this kind of system, you can also decouple the purchase of the battery from the purchase of the vehicle. So in theory, you can purchase a vehicle without a battery and then just subscribe to a battery swapping service. And then, you know, that, at least in the purchase price, can be kind of help with the gap there. So anyway, that's one thing that just came to mind, and then I'll let Alexander talk more.
I mean, certainly, what you just said, sort of separating the battery costs from the vehicle, either through battery swapping in the 2- and 3-wheeler segment or through innovative business models in the bus segment, is really important. And I could say, yes, that's probably something like a best practice. I mean, we see this in the motorcycle market, with companies being active in Rwanda, being active in Kenya, and just one company which was founded in Rwanda, a small country with only 4 million inhabitants. They just celebrated their first 1,000 electric motorcycles on the road last week, and this is based on battery swapping. And battery swapping basically minimizes the risk for the vehicle user, for the taxi driver, for those who have actually no capital and who have also very hard times to access capital. And basically the capital intense operation would then be with the energy provider, which is the company owning the battery, recharging the battery, organizing the swapping service and all these sort of things. And here it's basically really the challenge to convince financiers that this is an undertaking whereby the risk is now so manageable that it really makes sense to give them access to a large amount of financing. And I think this is something where still quite something can be done. On the bus side, similar things are happening with companies basically leasing out the battery to the bus operation company and charging them on a per kilometer basis. And by that, the investment costs for the bus is very close to a similar conventional bus, and then the business models make sure that with purchasing the bus and having some sort of kilometer-based or whatever-based price for the energy system provider, which takes care of the battery, is still annual savings, which are interesting enough for the bus operating company, can be achieved. And I think these are quite interesting models, and these are also models which seem to start working in low and middle income countries.
Thank you so much. And I think there are a couple of questions regarding circular economy, right, and recycling. So what is the level of readiness for the end of life management of lithium batteries, EVs lithium battery EVs in developing countries, right? Like recycling those developing countries, thinking about that.
I'm honestly not too sure. I think, you know, I would even argue in developed countries, it's not exactly at the level we'd want it today. So, but that's something that I think is on a lot of people's minds. And I do think we're starting to see policymakers, you know, looking towards kind of how to regulate that.
Very nice answer. I was just thinking about throwing the question back about how ready is the global north to actually really deal with large amounts of end-of-life batteries and all the sort of little bit unsolved questions relating to transporting batteries, reintegrating them back into the production cycle. First of all, I think it is, for low and middle income countries, it is an absolute urgent question to think about this. It is a question which will be very much in the focus of that CHEF 8 program, working on used electric vehicle batteries. working also on what sort of vehicles, of electric vehicles, shall be able to be exported, let's say, from global north to global south. I think, I believe the ECOWAS region in Western Africa is actually a very interesting one, because they are importing large amounts of used vehicles. They are to a very high share coming from Europe. Europe already having now a 16% share of new registered vehicles being electric. So a lot of these, or some of these countries in ECOWAS region, having age limits of like 5 years. I mean, you can put together a very simple model and you will see that at growing sales shares of electric vehicles in Europe, there will be more or less without alternative also a growing share of used electric vehicles coming to these countries. And basically it is a matter of urgency to think about what shall be regulated in terms of what is allowed to come into the country, and then also thinking about how can these vehicles, and once they reach their end of lifetime, and once the batteries reach their end of lifetime, how can batteries be either repurposed for energy storage? I mean, that might be something interesting. Maybe something which looks in theory better than it looks in practice. That is to be determined. The other question is then, how can these materials in these batteries be reintroduced into the production cycle? And this is very much something we want to sort of investigate over the next coming years.
Perfect. And I know we are out of time, but I would like to thank Elizabeth and Alexander for sharing your experiences and all the work. We really appreciate it. And all of the participants as well for attending this webinar. As you all know, we have recorded this webinar and we'll be sharing the recording, and we'll be posting on the Clean Energy Solutions Center's website as well. And if your questions were not answered, please feel free to reach out and we'll make sure that those questions get answered. But again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And it was very informative. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.